Alright everyone, so God Valley continues to be an absolute 10 out of 10 flashback, and this chapter confirmed something very, very big for me, which is that Emu will be showing up at God Valley. To understand what I mean, we need to get to the end of this review, but first let's break this down bit by bit. Highlight number 1 was, of course, f***ing Garp. I think Garp is putting a lot of doubters to rest over the course of this flashback in particular, and when I say a lot of doubters, I'm kind of including myself here because we've all always known that Garp is supposed to be very, very strong. We knew certain things, like he's the hero of the Marines, he's the only Marine that ever really gave Gold Roger a run for his money. Roger himself talks about how they've nearly killed each other on many occasions, so we always got the picture that, okay, at Garp's full peak potential in his prime, he must have been really high up there. But I think the thing is that we as readers are also just hesitant to have too many ties and too many characters that we call, number one, the absolute strongest. So, from the beginning of the story, it was kind of like, okay, Roger was the Pirate King, and then Whitebeard, world's strongest man, and Roger and Whitebeard are established to be equal to one another, so that was kind of like it. I think most people were happy with Roger and Whitebeard are equals, and they were the two strongest from that old era, and then we started to hear that Garp is also up there as well, but it was never literally explicitly spelled out for us that Garp was equal to Roger, at least for many, many hundreds of chapters. We just heard that, Garp cornered Roger, or Garp and Roger nearly killed each other. So I think there was enough vagueness there that it was like, okay, do we say Garp was exactly equal to Roger? I think if you look at most lists, that people tend to put out of strongest characters ever, what I tend to notice is that, you've either got Roger and Whitebeard, and then maybe Garp like a couple spots right after them or something. And then, of course, once Rox started being established more, it was like, okay, well, Rox is clearly a huge deal. So then people started putting Rox in those conversations as well, so then I started to see things like ties, like Rox, Roger, Whitebeard, the three strongest pirates ever, three strongest from that old generation. And then the more it got established that, okay, Harold was also that dude, people just don't like having that many characters basically just like, okay, these characters are all Pirate King level. So I think that Garp sometimes would get the short end of the stick in that it was just easy to underrate him because there was just a little bit less dialogue about him. But now, as this flashback has progressed, I'm just gonna be honest, the way Oda has been portraying characters at God Valley itself, he gave Garp the absolute best introduction at the end of chapter 1160. Garp also just gets the most badass points for the simple fact that while Rox is rolling up with this crew filled with Yonkos and legendary pirates, and Roger's rolling up with these Conqueror's Haki users Rayleigh and Gaban, Garp is essentially rolling up by himself. None of the other Marines on that ship of his mean jack. He doesn't have a single admiral on his side. It's literally him just going in solo after all these pirates. But we also saw from Roger and Rox's reactions at the end of last chapter 1160 that for some reason that's actually totally reasonable and they're still worried about Garp. And then this chapter 1161 we found out why. Garp is the true Haki bed in One Piece. There is no other Haki bed. It's only Garp. Everybody else has swords or some legendary weapon or of course devil fruits. Garp is the only dude out here hunting Yonko like they are his prey for fun. And you have Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom all running the away from one dude who is just using his fists. And it turns out that Zeus and Prometheus can't even do jack to Garp. He is just that dude. Now I know everybody is not yet probably at their absolute best. I imagine Whitebeard is probably the closest, just based on age, based on, him clashing with Roger later this chapter, and based on, I think, some magazine establishing that Whitebeard is almost at his prime as of God Valley, but not quite. But Garp still had 3 Yonko who are not far off from their primes on the run. I have a much bigger video talking about why Garp is actually way, way, way more important than we all realized coming out next week, as well as why Oda likely underplayed his strength for some time to give us a more impactful reveal later, but that's enough Garp glaze for the moment. But first, if you want to get One Piece's beautiful islands for your walls, you can get any 2 island posters and get another 2 free and free shipping on our brand new site, OneDreamStudio.com. And a huge congratulations to our giveaway winner, Jules Marquise Farley, who will be receiving the complete Island Posters collection. Thank you everyone for participating. And as thanks to everyone who participated, check your emails for a giveaway exclusive special. And we know how much you all enjoyed the Island Posters, but we've got something even bigger for you around the corner. What we've got next for you all is something you're not going to find anywhere else. Stay tuned. The other standout moment from this chapter and from that similar scene was, of course, Dragon's situation with that God's Knight. So interestingly, I had assumed, and I think many people had assumed, that this God's Knight woman was maybe Killingham's mother, which might still be possible, but she's from a different family. And what's really interesting is that this woman might have Kizaru's Devil Fruit, because as we know, that beam attack that we see now is very common in pacifistas and robots and everything. That beam is actually originally copied from Kizaru's Devil Fruit, and it's implied that is a very new development in the modern day of One Piece. So this shouldn't have been technology, 38 years ago. Oda's keeping it ambiguous because he's having her fire the beam from her mouth, which is obviously not how Kizaru would do it, but is rather how pacifistas would do it. But at the same time, it just doesn't make sense unless the world government was really hiding a ton of technology developments. But it doesn't make sense because the world government just shouldn't have had the technology for pacifistas at that point in time. So it feels like Kizaru really should have had that Devil Fruit. And that does lead to an interesting question, which is that, okay, a God's Knight potentially initially had this very powerful Logia, and we can imagine that this woman died at some point, presumably in battle or maybe old age or something like that. And so then does the world government just keep really powerful Devil Fruits like that in-house and basically just pick it up and be like, okay, we're going to pass this on to another soldier of ours who's really, really strong in the future. And so then it went down and was passed on to Kizaru. I would not be surprised if that's the case. Also note, what's interesting from this scene is that it seems like a lot of the Celestial Dragons, a lot of the God's Knights don't seem to like each other, which makes a lot of sense because when you have so many shitty people together all in one group, of course they're going to have issues with one another. They're used to being able to trample and have their way and just do whatever they want to all the commoners, but then, they are all amongst themselves on the same level, so they just view each other as giant assholes. And it seems like Garling in particular is disliked by the God's Knights, as we also saw from Sommers commenting on him later on in the chapter. So Garling seems to be an exceptional asshole even by God's Knight and Celestial Dragon standards, which makes a lot of sense what we've been seeing. Now, there is one thing that happens this chapter that is slightly concerning for me. So we get to see the separation of the two infants, Shamrock and Shanks. And Shamrock, obviously, we can see how he ends up back in Garling's hands. But with Shanks, it seems like Shanks is knocked unconscious. And we can assume that Dragon is able to retrieve Shanks and put Shanks away and hide him in the chest and everything like that. But I'm a little bit worried about one thing, one potential plot development Oda might go with, which is that I hope that Shanks seemingly getting a bump on his head is not turned into a big deal. Because I feel like if you watch my last video, Shanks and Shamrock as two genetically practically identical twins being separated at birth and being raised in two very different environments by two very different parents, one being raised among pirates to be raised as a free thinker under a kind-hearted man like Roger, and one being raised under Celestial Dragons to grow up with discrimination and hate in your heart by a cold-hearted, cruel man like Garling. That fated divergence and the two men that Shanks and Shamrock respectively grow up to be, that carries tremendous narrative implications for how we are supposed to view the Celestial Dragons. Like, what is our takeaway about the nature of evil that is the Celestial Dragons? How much of it is to blame on their natural innate evil that they're born with versus the fact that they're grown up and raised in such a hateful environment that skews their moral compass so dramatically far off? That is a very, very important issue that I feel like One Piece has to tackle. So I really hope that Shanks, having gotten a little bump on his head, isn't used as an excuse for like, that's why Shanks grows up with such a different personality than Shamrock, because that is a damn shame. And it spits on the idea that One Piece has repeatedly taught us throughout the story, which is that when you are raised with love, you grow up with love in your heart, and then you pass that on down yourself. I'm not saying that one's nature needs to be entirely based on how you are raised, because some of your natural predilections as an individual, what you were born with, your genes, etc., are going to play a major part as well. But I hope that Oda doesn't skirt the question entirely by just being like, okay, well, Shanks got a bump on his head, and that's why he's just fundamentally different than Shamrock. But now we get to the finale of this chapter, and it's a very touching scene, which is obviously Rayleigh stomping Sommers. I like that Oda didn't rush through this. He actually dragged out the scene a little bit of Sommers really hurting Shaki and making us feel for her in that situation and making us, the reader, want to see someone come in and put a stop to this. And I like that Oda so far has been using Sommers as basically that classic villain that's the giant asshole that repeatedly gets his shit kicked in when the hero arrives. So that happened first with Gaban in the modern day, and we saw it happen again with Rayleigh right here. So I was thinking Rayleigh might have to go up against a very strong opponent to save Shaki, Shaki, but I kind of like this route more, which is just that Rayleigh comes through and effortlessly stomps the dude that is abusing her. It definitely makes for a tighter scene and allows us to focus more on the emotions of Rayleigh and Shaki uniting. I think Oda did that whole scene really well, and knowing how they are today and how close they've become today, I do actually genuinely like the little romance that Oda played throughout this whole flashback, and it basically reaching its conclusion right here. I think Roger and Gaban's reactions are really funny to this. I just like the whole way that played out. But here is why I think that Imu is practically confirmed to be coming to God Valley at this point, which is, it feels like the narrative of God Valley just kind of wrapped up, at least for the heroes, the Roger Pirates, right? They got Shaki, they saved her, now they can get out of here. There's no real reason for them to even want to fight Rocks at this point. So Oda's kind of painting the picture of a happy ending, but we know that things aren't done yet. We know that something big still has to come for the whole God Valley incident to actually erupt into that battle that we were told about, where it's like Garp and Roger versus Rocks and everything. And we know, if you watch my previous videos, Imu is set up to be the main villain of the Elbaf arc, and this flashback began with Imu being established as the main villain of the world, really not Rocks. So I think this all sets up for the wrench in the works to be thrown in very soon, which is Imu arriving to shit up at the end of this God Valley incident. So things are going to take a sharp left turn very soon. I rate this chapter a 10 out of 10, and I'm really looking forward to what comes next. And finally, we have the voice from the people, my top tier of patrons. So Jay pointed out Whitebeard and Roger clashing, but swords touching equals Roger weaker than Harold as of 1161. So I personally am of the belief that Roger is not quite at his peak yet, but I strongly believe we will be seeing a significant Haki bloom from Roger by the end of God Valley. And I think this whole battle is set to be the debut of Roger reaching Pirate King level, as this is set to be the most extreme and significant battle of Roger's life. And as we know, Haki blooms can only happen in the heat of extreme battle. So if Roger is ever going to reach Pirate King level, it's going to happen here. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the rest of God Valley. I'll talk to you all later.